Thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about the impacts of religious and spiritual trauma and how to heal from it. My name is Carrie Jackson, and namaste. I use that Sanskrit to say the divine in me sees and honors the divine in you. And so may that be our experience together today. So exactly what is religious and spiritual trauma? Well, first of all, the term religious trauma was coined in 2011, so just 12 years ago, by a British psychologist. And some might say, just in 2011? I've experienced that all of my life. I didn't know there was a term or not a term, but I know the experience. That might be what you are saying and thinking right now. But blessings to psychologist Marlene Winell, who did coin that term. And it was thereafter that religious trauma syndrome became something added to the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Mental Health Disorders, the DSM, as many of you might know it. And it gave it a place then for psychologists and therapists and counselors who heretofore had not touched into the spiritual and religious traumas and abuses that many people had experienced in their life, because there was this bifurcation. Here's the psychological, or there was false bifurcation. Let me emphasize that. Here's the psychological and here's the spiritual. And so many traditional psychologists and therapists would not touch the spiritual and the religious issues that clients would bring to their lives. And so I'm glad it was added. It has helped create more integrative conversation for folks to look at the range of issues that impact their lives and the post-traumatic stress syndromes that they might have experienced that show up in so many different ways. So thanks for joining us today. That's what I'm going to say. So exactly what is religious trauma? That's what I was supposed to be explaining, right? So any experience that causes a stress, that causes a sense of degrading, danger, abuse, or results in damage in someone's life that comes from the context of their religious or spiritual teaching, home, spiritual community, etc. And so the traumatizing experience might not be because someone threw you into a pool in the name of Jesus and you didn't know what was going on. It might have been something else that said, if you are not just perfect in these ways prescribed by our religion, that you are going to go to hell, or that you are damaged, you're broken, you're not good enough. The traumatizing effects or events can happen in a variety of ways, spoken and unspoken. People's behaviors, people ignoring you, rejecting you, on and on and on. So many different kinds of ways. And we'll hear more about that today as we share some of the stories from the amazing panelists that we have here today. So I'm just delighted that we have with us my dear friend Dax. I'm just going to use first names. So my dear friend Dax, my dear friend Sean, my dear friend Carson. And we've heard from people who registered, who sent in some questions, but I'm going to kick it off with a few questions. So Dax, I'm going to start with you if that's okay. When you think about religious trauma, religious and spiritual trauma in your own life, what has that looked like for you, and what has been the impact?
I, yeah, this was a good question for me to consider because there's a lot of things in my religious, and I didn't get into any organized religion until I was about 13, and I chose it myself. I took myself to a church myself because I needed some stability from what was happening in my life. And there was a lot of welcome initially, and it just felt like home. It felt like this is the place where I'm going to be safe. And as I got closer to them, the less I was allowed to um, be in the relationships that were just my natural relationships. It started being where I had to cut off some of the people in my life, and then it was that even the ones that I couldn't cut off, such as my parents, I had to start making boundaries with them and keeping them out in certain ways. And I remember one situation where I was told to go through my house and get rid of anything in the house that had a pagan type influence. And so that meant bringing all of my mom collected all these unicorns, bringing them all to be destroyed, and having them come over and pray in my house, and just like a lot of things that created a sense of separation between me and my family. And the more honest I became about any aspect of my life, the less accepting they became. So I very quickly learned, if I'm going to be accepted by this group of people, I have to be dishonest about aspects of myself. I have to hide some things, and I have to change some very key things that I didn't feel like made sense to change. The other thing that stands out to me about just the grooming aspect of it was that all of the ideas about God came externally. So it was not anything that my ideas were not, unless they were directly in line with their own theology. My own ideas weren't acceptable. So I was constantly going elsewhere for an idea of who God was, rather than an internal sense of that in myself. And ultimately, what that led to for me was being completely dependent on them for occupation. So my finances came from them, all of my friendships came from them, all of my livelihood came from them, my esteem came from them. And then ultimately, whenever I came out at the time as a queer person, prior to even knowing the words for being trans, that led to my disfellowshipment, which led to loss of job, loss of income, loss of the entire support system. And for me, it meant loss for my concept of God. They prayed a prayer that I would suffer so much in this life I might return to God. They prayed that godly sorrow would bring about repentance. And my grandmother developed cancer shortly after that. And I spent a good deal of my 20s thinking I had caused that. So this belief that somehow that my actions were going to annihilate my family. And so it just completely leveled who I was as a person, and all of my validation came externally. I didn't have any of that inner resource to draw on. So that's what it looked like for me.
Wow. Thank you so very much for sharing that. I'm feeling it. I didn't go through that particular experience, but just feeling so much of that. And I look forward to more conversation as well about what has helped you heal in that process. But Carson, may I come to you next? Same question, your experience and what impact in your life has that?
In some ways, my story is similar to Dax in that I didn't start going to church regularly till I was 16. But I grew up in a culture that was deeply immersed in Southern Baptist beliefs and values. And so it was in the air you breathe. So it was ingrained in me whether I grew up actually attending church or not. And that has been very clear to me since then in the ways that it shows up in my everyday life. But the church taught a wrathful, condemning God, one that was making a list of all the things you did wrong. And if you hit a certain number or certain gravity of things on the list, then you were going to hell and there was no saving you, even though there was talk about Jesus and how Jesus saves us. There were still things that you could do that would sort of erase that. And so we weren't allowed to ask questions. We weren't really allowed to think for ourselves. The pastor told you how to think and what to believe and how to feel about things. And so it became my church and my family as well, that in this idea of a wrathful and condemning God, just kind of taking notes about everything that you were doing wrong. And it was, it really was a kind of list of don'ts. There wasn't much do's that you could do. It was really kind of keeping up with the don'ts. But in the midst of those first, even though I was 16, those first formative years for me, like the wrathful, condemning father and my earthly father, like the characteristics of wrathful and condemning and all that were really intertwined, in that I saw the two as very similar. Women and girls were supposed to be silent and submissive, and there wasn't places for ordination or anything like that for women. And like that impacted me in a way that I thought that there was something inherently wrong with me, because I thought differently than my family. And I was a person, I think, when I was really little, that asked a lot of questions. And so that was squelched in the asking of the questions and the saying, kind of speaking my mind. Like I constantly got in trouble for that as a youngster. And so that was just stifled so much in me that I thought there was something inherently wrong with me, that God couldn't even love me, and that my family of origin couldn't love me. And what hope does that give me for love in my life if your family of origin and God, who are supposed to be the ones that love you for now and always, didn't love who you are and how you thought and how you maneuvered the world? And so I carried a lot of shame in my mind, in my emotions, in my body, in my spirit, especially. It shattered any sense of God that I might have started to have. But God was like this old white man in the sky out there somewhere, like Dax was talking about, very external. There wasn't any talk about any kind of internal spirit that was always with me. That would come much later in my healing process. But I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust God. I didn't trust other people. And that impacted me in that I played small my whole life. And I didn't feel like I had anybody that I could depend on, nor did I have anybody that loved me. And that made me go looking for love in all the wrong places. And just the not thinking for myself. And that really impacted my decision-making process. I was waiting for people to tell me how to think and how to behave and what to feel. And I didn't have any clue, that wasn't even on my radar to think about what I might want or what might feel good or life-giving for me. So.
Thank you. I'm hearing some themes, and Sean, I'm going to ask you to reflect on that same question, and then I'm going to follow it up with some information about common effects of religious trauma. But what each of you has spoken to so far is really speaking to a lot of those. Sean?
You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Mhm.
I had a similar where I similar but different. In that I actually was raised in the church. I was baptized in the church. I was taken to church up until I, was in my 20s. And church was the focal point of my family. In fact, my mother really encouraged my brother and I both to go into ministry because she so was involved in the church. And it wasn't until I got into my teens that like I could really see the writing on the wall, if that makes sense, of things didn't line up. The way my parents behaved, the way that we behaved at church, the way that things were very about perception and how people see you, really just did not go with the message that we were talking about around love and acceptance and, being for the community and supporting the community. It was like all that applies to everybody but you here in this building. And we should be that for other people, but here in this building, we're going to have a lot of judgment for each other. These are the rules about what you can and can't do. And like Carson said, there's a lot more that you can't do than you can do. And it really was a lot around like what you could and couldn't be as a person, even in the world. There's not a lot of pathway for what women can do. Women were supposed to be seen and not heard. And if you happen to be a queer person, like it was okay that you were a queer person, but like you can't be in leadership positions in the church. You can't be in these types of roles and you can't ever talk about it. We don't talk about it. You can't really talk about any of the trueness of your life. All of it has to be above board in terms of like, we only talk about these high quality pieces of our life. We don't talk about the stuff that's happening in the back room or the stuff that's happening downstairs in the basement or the stuff, we didn't talk about real life or real selves. And you could really see like the theology of the church break down when big life events happen. Like I remember the first time that somebody I was close to passed away, and all of this belief around like how we interact with each other and how there wasn't space for that anymore. The things about living your life to the best and all good things will come your way. Like if you meet all of these requirements, you'll get everything that you want and need. And that wasn't happening. How do you keep having that same belief when most of the people in our congregation were living in poverty? Most of us didn't have a whole lot and people were dying. And it just was not, it didn't all match. And then, I started being an advocate and wanting to, explore leadership roles as a queer person and really wanting to see the church community I loved grow too. And that didn't happen. And when that didn't happen, it came with a lot of like, who are you now? And what is this? And you're going to go to hell and hell is coming immediately. And it just didn't fit with what I knew we were, preaching out in the community that come, we want you here. But once you're here for 3 weeks, the rules are going to change and you better be ready for those rules to change because now you're in a different position and you need to live up to those standards.
What's been the impact of that on your life, Sean?
Say that again.
How has that impacted your life?
Another great question. It has really led to me, seeking out different paths of ministry. I was in the church for some time and then I left the church because I didn't see a path forward to help people that we were needing to help. And I didn't see a path forward to have a family. And so I left and I moved to nonprofit life, and my life kind of became anti-church for a little while, and anti-God and anti-spirituality. And I, even in seminary, I was at seminary in time, and even in seminary, I'd said, oh, I'm just going to go an academic path. I'll just be a professor, and that way I don't lose the education I've started with, but I, will move away from being in the church. And, but, the spirit gets you regardless. So I ended up being in a place where I really desperately needed a job. And I applied to a whole bunch of secular jobs and a whole bunch of church jobs, and just needed to be able to pay bills. And the only jobs I was offered were church jobs. And I found my way back, and I was able to really to not just see a different way, but to help create a different way and create a different path, and to be some of those things in a different light. But it really took me a long time to come back to it. I really was it was so turned away from it because of how much trauma it caused in me to see people that I loved putting on this different face and being two-faced in many ways, and lots of lying and cleaning up our story or cleaning up our act, and really just kind of beating people with scripture in ways that just were not helpful to the things they were already experiencing. And I went to seminary originally because I was like, there's got to be more to this Bible thing than just using it as a weapon. There's got to be more in here. I need to understand it. And so it led me to seminary in the first place, and I found my way in that. But it really took me a long time, and still today there are pieces that I still haven't figured out for myself. I've been able to reclaim certain things, and I've been able to work through certain things, but just when I think I've gotten to the edge of like, oh, I think this is the last piece of it, there's another thread that unravels itself to see, oh, actually there's this other piece that I didn't even think was related to how my parents were acting with me or how my parents were parenting, that was actually really rooted in what they understood from scripture and what they understood from church guidelines. Like, it just constantly seems to come up.
Thank you. I want to note that all of us in this call have been shaped by Christian teaching. But when we talk about religious trauma, that can be someone's experience from any tradition. I really want to underscore that. And I thank each of you as you speak about your Christian experience, and really want to underscore the things can show up in so many other ways. So some common impacts that we've heard run as themes in what each of you has spoken: self-hatred, shame, perfectionism, hypervigilance, difficulty making decisions because you don't trust yourself, loss of community, and that's those who you had prior to coming into the traumatizing context, lack of boundaries, that encroachment from others telling you how you should be and then not really clear about knowing who you are, delayed social milestones because you don't trust yourself, believing that other people have authority over you, and the challenge in accomplishing certain things for your own life, especially as it relates to gender, sexuality, sex, marriage, procreation, what kinds of jobs, employment, careers, etc. Sexual dysfunction is often a common experience, and mental health issues such as depression and anxiety and eating disorders and addiction. One thing that is not often talked about as a common impact that I think really is, and one of you mentioned this, is that tendency towards saviorism. And I know that that was very much true in my own life. Got to rescue other people because, Mighty Mouse, I grew up, here I come to save the day. And so sometimes the theology can greatly lead toward that kind of thinking. So I want to thank you because I want to, oh, you have such great things. So are there places in your life, areas of your life that you believe the religious traumatizing experiences have kept you stuck? Because often we only think of religious trauma as relating to religious and spiritual things. But if you'll think beyond that, beyond what your relationship with the divine has looked like, other aspects of your life where you've seen yourself have the challenge to grow and expand because of the religious trauma. Can you speak to that? Who will go first? Carson, may I ask you to go?
Oh, go Carson.
Sure. So my initial answer to the question is everywhere, like relationships, finances, you know, my sense of self. For it to even be on my radar to think about what I want, or what, like, I keep talking about, like, wanting to create this life that I love. I don't even know what that is or what that looks like. Like, because I haven't thought about those things for so many decades, to sit and sort of think about or spend some time trying to figure out what it is I want or what I think it looks like that imagining is a really difficult thing for me even now. And this is decades later, but like, I spent almost 3 decades thinking my soul had died. Well, if you're maneuvering the planet and you really feel like and think that your soul has died, like, how are you really maneuvering the world? Like, that's affecting everything, like everything you do, what your relationships look like, whether I would ask for help or even allow people to share the load, or being able to receive from other people, like even compliments, like those seem to like bounce off of me. They don't really sink in. Like, I can't take those into my being. And that's part of that old, I feel like there's something inherently wrong with me, that they're just saying that. They don't really mean it. It's not really, I don't take that in as true. And just like disregarding my gut feelings, my intuition, my authentic self, the spirit that I now believe that is within me, and the wisdom of my body, like disconnection from my body. And so those things, affect everything in your life as you maneuver the world on a daily basis.
Thank you for that honesty. Really appreciate that. Sean, I'm going to come to you, and Dax, if you'll close out with that, with your answer to this same question.
Yeah, I think similarly to Carson, let me just real quick change my camera to be this camera. Similar to Carson, everything that religion really underpins in society, so does religious trauma underpin itself within you. So like, religion is in lots of our politics, it's in lots of our like structure of society, it's also in a lot of our structure as human beings. And so for me, like, my self-worth, my desires for where my career would go, the things that I've been willing to accept boundary-wise, the pieces of my life that I was trying to like cobble together and I didn't really have a plan anymore. Like, religion and church gave me this path, and it gave me a set of rules, and that gave me map in some ways, and then having to kind of, abandon that in some, language, to move away from that really was difficult. I struggled to, find jobs to kind of advocate for myself around like what a living wage is, and how I'll show up, and putting everything and all things of me into that job, and not being able to set boundaries around it came out of my, the way I was raised around being a part of the church and giving everything to the church. And that like ethic of moving and things was kind of just set in me and set in stone in some ways, and still taking some time to kind of resort out like, oh, you're actually capable of doing a lot of things. You're actually worthy of a lot more than you give yourself credit for. And actually I had a friend in seminary who, told me that I had standards that even like Jesus couldn't live up to, because I had been so ingrained to like, this is the priority, this is the expectation level, and if you don't meet it, then you're not worth anything. Very transactional situation around love and worthiness and capability. And it's taken a long time to individualize myself out of that, and to really see myself in a different way, and to see myself as divine creation again, to be able to say, oh, I was created for an actual purpose. I was created in a very special and unique and wonderful way. And it may seem weird to some others, but it was actually really intentional, and it has a way of being. And even the religious trauma itself has crafted this, part of who I am that shows up in ways that I never really imagined, even when I was, trying to come out of it. Even when I did have a path and a map. So I'll pass to Dex then.
I think for me, my entire being was constructed around either proving them wrong or being afraid that they were right. So that everything that I was doing was in a reactionary state rather than a choiceful state. Like, I don't think I was making choices through much of my life until I unpacked some of it. And for me, I was part of a Pentecostal church that really was high energy. So I was used to this experience of high energy, high relief, high emotional relief, like a cathartic experience, and that was really a part of everything. Everything was so intense that I couldn't find that intensity in life, and drugs and alcohol became a huge part of that for me. Like, the only way I could manufacture anything close to what I experienced there as a sense of welcome was obliteration. So for me, I went from these states of either being obliterated or being completely in a reactionary state. And I was confused pretty much all the time, even whenever I was certain. So even in my certainty, I felt this sense of, am I right? So I would be all in on something and constantly questioning myself. So it felt like I was never present to any moment I was ever in. I don't remember my wedding because I was so afraid that they were going to show up and picket it in some way or interrupt it in some way. And so and then right after the wedding, I got massively drunk. Like, that was my response to everything, was I need to change this feeling because I can't control this feeling. So much of my 20s and 30s was reactionary. It wasn't ever a choiceful state that I was in. And I feel like if I had an image for it, it was just pinballing, and they were always at the center. So I was either taking a stance that was directly against them because I needed to get as far away from them as possible, or I was reenacting those relationships in my life and playing it out like a psychodrama. So choosing people around me that I was trying to work out my stuff with, that really I didn't enjoy being around, but I couldn't help but choose these relationships again and again and again. And it just felt endless, and like I had no control over my life. I felt like someone else was pulling all the strings for me.
Wow, what each of you has shared is so powerful. And again, thank you for your the self-revealing, the transparency. Really appreciate that. And so my final question to each of you, and Sean, I'm going to start with you, is based on your own journey, are there specific recommendations you offer to help other people heal in their own process, recovering from religious and spiritual trauma?
Yeah. Get a therapist. Step one. Or a spiritual director or spiritual companion, or get somebody that you have a space where you can talk that stuff out with. And the other thing that I highly, highly recommend, which actually I learned from Carson. So Carson always said, I'll love you till you can love yourself. And, you know, lean into those relationships, because that helped me through so many times that I just couldn't figure out my own divineness, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I really needed to say somebody show me what that could look like, and what a healthy version of love could look like, what an unconditional version of love could look like, so that my brain could wrap its own self around it to see, oh, actually, you can give this to you. You don't have to, you know, wait for Carson. You don't have to wait for other friends. You don't, you can really provide what you need for yourself. And that gave me the chance to find my own empowerment and find my own power, and take that back, and reclaim it in lots of ways. And then to be able to provide the same space back, which was healing in its own way. And the other one is just to keep seeking out people that are like you, because there's more of us than you would think. When I first got to seminary, I did not think that there would be other people who came from religious trauma, that came from any kind of trauma, that we would all just be perfect, pristine little angels, and that we would all just be fine. And I was open to a community that had similar experiences, and other folks that had, you know, all different types of trauma and all different types of religious backgrounds, and some healthy, some unhealthy. And being able to be in community with other people who were struggling with similar things gave me space to be able to see I'm not alone. It's not just me. And one of my solutions around trauma was just to say that I was the problem. If I'm the problem, I can solve that quicker than somebody else being the problem, or culture being the problem. And so seeing other people really changed my understanding of that, and that I was special in other ways, but I wasn't special in that way. And that helped a lot.
Thank you. Dax, and then Carson, if you'll close us.
You know, therapy was ultimate for me. I remember the day when my therapist, who has a Jewish and Buddhist background, asked me, Dax, did you throw baby Jesus out with the bathwater? and we talked about the aspects of my faith that I felt like I wanted to start to look at again. And that was a very powerful day for me. And to be able to sift through that with someone who did not have any investment in me developing a theology in any way, and just wanted me to be a whole healed person was gracious and lovely. I would say something that's been powerful for me is reclaiming ritual. Any ritual in my life that I missed, because there were aspects, like I realized I missed communion. And so and not just the idea of sharing something with others. And so I intentionally made a decision within myself that I was going to be having these monthly dinners where I didn't need to announce it to them, but this was my communion. Like, this is mine. This is my breaking of bread, and it's an intentional spiritual thing that I'm doing, and putting myself in that. Being around people that had healed. was huge for me. So that had done some of their work and done some of their healing, and just listening to them and what their processes were, and going to places where it seemed like there were other people just like me. Even if I didn't believe in anything else that they believed in, they had gone through something similar to mine. I read a tremendous amount of Anne Lamott, and that helped me a lot. And one of the things that she said was go as slowly, go only as fast as the slowest part of you. And that became my mantra, is I was not going to get involved in any community until the slowest part of me was willing to be a part of that community too. And so I leveled myself at that pace and went very, very, very slow.
Thanks, Dex. So for me, it was finding places where I could, one, learn that it was okay to ask questions, and then two, ask the questions that were within me that I didn't even know in a life-giving environment. I actually found it in seminary classes, but it doesn't have to be that. Like it can be friends, it can be classes, it can be, for me, I had both a therapist and a spiritual director simultaneously for more than a decade now. And it was really because what I have found in my experience is that therapists are not trained in spiritual pieces. And so they can help you with some of the stuff, but my foundational thing was spiritual. And so if you're not touching my foundational thing, you're not helping me in ways that I need the most. And so I added a spiritual director to it. And the spiritual director was the person who, to allow me safe space to unpack and ask questions and be angry at God if I wanted to. Like I couldn't even say the word God. For the first year and a half, I was in spiritual direction because it had such baggage and such harm and such just angst for me. But yet she was willing to hold space for me anyway. And so she walked with me in a different way than, a person who doesn't have religious trauma. A spiritual director might walk with you in a different way, but she understood where I was coming from and really literally saved my life on several occasions. And like Dax, I would say start small. Don't think it has to be this huge thing. And seek ways to broaden your perspective about what's possible. For me, that was reading. Like a lot of things I could get my hands on, and it doesn't have to be spiritual books necessarily. It could be anything that sort of calls to you. But for me, it happened in seminary. And so it happened to be some spiritual books. It happened to be trauma books. Understanding the impacts of trauma helped me understand that I was not crazy and there wasn't something inherently wrong with me. The ways in which I was acting in the world was from the effects of trauma. It wasn't something that I wasn't smart enough or strong enough to work my way through or whatever. And that was profoundly life-changing for me. And I would say when you're ready, and this may be a never, but if you have had spiritual or religious trauma, one thing that helped me, an exercise that I happened to do in seminary, and it takes being in a certain space to be ready, but I started reading scripture for myself. I was so afraid to pick up the Bible for so long because it had been used to whack me upside the head and be harmful for me. But to sit down and pick a passage or whatever, and one, think about, this is what I was taught it said. And then two, this is what I was taught it meant. And then three, read it for myself and see what comes up or how I particularly see it, or what comes up for me about, wait, they're saying it means this and it says this and it doesn't, like those kind of things. And that exercise was really helpful in my healing process.
Thank each of you so very, very much. And I'm going to open this to questions. We have one amazing person in our studio audience. If you have a question, you are welcome to ask that, Linda. And if you don't, that is more than fine. But if you do, just let us know.
And Carrie, we also have people on Facebook Live that can ask.
Oh, and wonderful people on Facebook Live. But Linda, I'm going to give you first dibs if you would like to ask a question. And if it doesn't bubble up now, that doesn't mean you can't ask it in another 2 or 3 minutes.
Well, thank you. I was curious about this particular panel, not because I consider myself a Christian. Actually, I don't. But the trauma that I went through that basically defined me as not a Christian, sort of a weird type of thing, was why I came to see the commonalities. I guess my question has to deal with, if I'm to open up the Bible for the first time, or I'm not sure how to read it with clear eyes. I guess, Carson, you were kind of talking about it, because I have so much negativity about Christianity. I mean, my family Christianity was basically evil because of all the stuff, you know, the politics and all that kind of stuff, you know, colonizers, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. So I'm just trying to break that trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, do you have any suggestions as to how to open the Bible or where I should start? You know, maybe it's too big of a question, but that's
Hmm.
so I'd like to know. That's it.
Wow. Wow. May I jump in with that? First, thank you so much for recognizing the generational, the impact of generational trauma as it relates to religion, because often we think only about our own direct experience, but it can happen across generations and cause many people to say, I don't want anything to do with that stuff, and perhaps throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so really asking, is there a baby here that might be valuable for my life, or some aspects of it that might be valuable for my life, even in the context of the incredible generational trauma that has impacted me and my clan. So I'm excited about your question, not only because of how it offers this lens about generational impacts, but also I absolutely love leading Bible studies. I haven't done it since I have not served as a pastor in a number of years. One of the things I do is teach annually, I teach a class for One Spirit Interfaith Seminary in New York. And there are people from different spiritual traditions in the course. I specifically talk about Protestantism and look at it from a historical and theological lens. Your question raises for me, oh, do I want to lead a Bible study for people who have experienced religious trauma? So that's a whole thing. I'm just appreciating your question, because it's causing me to think about something that I need to reflect on. It's just an exciting thing, because your point about how do you start? And there is the importance of looking at the historical and cultural contexts in which the texts were penned, and the historical and cultural context in which certain passages were lifted up, or certain book, because there's a whole lot more that's been written that didn't get included in this, what most people understand is the Christian Bible. And you know, maybe that's something we might do, and invite people from other traditions to do something similar with their own texts, because texts across traditions have been used as weapons. Certain kinds of theological and spiritual frames lend themselves even more for the kinds of abuses and traumas that we were speaking about. And Christianity is one of those. And I say this boldly and openly as an ordained Christian minister. Got to tell the truth about that, and how to help people find, hey, there is a baby in here that's rich, and what do we need to, how do we reclaim that? Carson. You're muted,
Wait,
Carson.
there I am. So that actually reminds me of one of the things that was helpful in my healing, was I had to start out visiting other spiritual avenues and places than the one I came from. And that was part of what helped me in my healing as well, because I had PTSD. When my butt hit the pew, I went into this PTSD mode. And so to go and visit other places where I wasn't hearing the same things in the same ways, and the structure wasn't the same, like those things helped me. And so maybe that's a piece of it for you, Linda, is just to go kind of visit some different places and just kind of see how that feels, or see if that even is something you are actually interested in pursuing or not.
Okay. No, thank you. Susan and I, my wife and I, we've started to go visit different religious or spiritual places. Where I live, there's a lot of Buddhists. I mean, it's about 20% of the population, if not more, Buddhists. So we're just hitting a lot of different, but I always know for me to walk into a Christian church is just a little hyperventilating for me. But I take your suggestion to heart.
So I would say, pay attention to that. If it makes you hyperventilate, maybe that's not the avenue you want to pursue. But you are the one that can figure that out for yourself.
Yeah, I think the last piece I would add to that is I didn't go to churches first. I didn't go to other like religious places first. I went to colleges first. I wanted to do the academic piece of it. I wanted to understand the cultural pieces of it. And so I went to archaeology classes at the community college, and I went to other ways that I could kind of approach it from a different place, so that it wasn't touching my trauma, but it was adjacent to what I wanted to know, so that I could kind of see, is there a way I could better understand, I may not want to dive into this entirely and live in it, or, dig into it for my own personal, but I want to understand pieces about how I might see it differently, because I need it to be able to heal my soul, and to figure out that piece of it. So I approached it totally from my nerdy brain place of, I'm going to go to this community college and figure out who is the older, archaeologist who still uses the slide projector and will click through a bunch of photos and show me all the cool stuff. I did it from that side first, and that helped me.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I
We
could
received,
add,
oh, go ahead, Dax.
just, being able to read some womanist theologians and womanist thinkers, because they lift the scripture in a very different way than it's ever been lifted by the patriarchal church. So I think that there is a lot out there that just doesn't get centered, and it just changes the lens for scripture entirely.
Do you have any names for me, Dax?
Yeah, I'll put some in the chat.
Oh, okay, thank you, sorry.
Thanks, Dax. We received a question from someone in the audience about purity culture and the impact of that. Do any of you want to respond to that question? Because I got a whole bunch to say about that, but I want our panelists to respond to that as you would like.
I can respond a little bit. I know for myself, when I started questioning my sexuality, purity culture and like modesty policing was a big piece for me. Like, and I saw it in my other like community members too. There were so many of us that were trying to navigate, like, at the time gay marriage wasn't legal, and like purity culture was really influencing my understanding of what marriage could mean, and my understanding of like what a long-term relationship would mean, and really limiting that understanding of my like fullness. And I saw it in other friends of mine too, who just could not see a future for their relationships because they had been taught that marriage was the only way that you could be in relationship with somebody, to live with somebody, to be intimate with somebody. Like, those were very strong priorities, and not being able to have that really limited what they could see in their like long-term partner, or their ability to have a family with that partner. And I've seen it in other ways too. Like it impacts, I think, the way that I like even my cleanliness standards around my house being raised. I know it seems weird that like it wouldn't be a relational thing, but like my relationship to the way my house looks and if people can come over was definitely impacted by purity culture. And not like, if my house doesn't look pristine, then nobody can come over to see the house, because the priority is that we need to look our best and like have our best, and it needs to be this absolute perfect like white tablecloth kind of situation. And I didn't even associate that to a whole longer term thing. I always thought about purity in relationship, and it's only recently, like in some conversations with my therapist, that I've started to see how purity is impacted in other ways. So I am curious how it is for other folks too, Dax and Carson, but there's a lot of ways I think that I haven't even personally been able to like pull out how it's been.
Thank you so much. And I've heard countless individuals talk about how purity culture and the policing of sexuality writ large impacts them in their committed relationships, marriage and otherwise, that people are afraid of their own sexuality. And am I doing it right? Is pleasure really something okay for me to have sexually? Or is it only a procreative measure? And so many things that come up for folks. So now there's a whole generation of people who are in the process of healing from purity culture. And I know when I was growing up in church, that was before the purity culture movement began, but all of the same elements were very, very much there, and we were not allowed to dance. And so in my early years, the only way I could let myself free up to dance I had to have a drink, which was also something I was not allowed to do. And so then I had to say, well, I really don't want to drink. I just want to be free, and so really looking at a variety of ways that the traumatizing contexts, there's a toxicity in the context. Again, whether people say words or not, but it's in the air. And in so many ways, the air within spiritual communities and the teaching spills into the broader society. And Sean, you talked about that earlier, that some people, even if they've not grown up practicing any religious tradition, the air that they breathe in the society has impacted them tremendously. And so those of you who are listening, you might say, well, I wasn't in those contexts, so I was not traumatized. And I just invite you to think about that. Are there some ways that you don't trust your own instincts, that it's difficult for you to make decisions, that you find yourself feeling a need to be perfect? If you're shaming and blaming yourself, some of those things might have come from your family of origin, or they might have come from some of the teaching that spills into the broader society. We all deserve to be free. And Sean talked about the importance of unconditional love. So much of the harm that is caused by religious and spiritual trauma gives people the message that they have to work hard to deserve to be loved. And we're here to tell you, you are love. And there's nothing you need to do to deserve giving or receiving love. So if you need a spiritual director, we have a team of people who would be glad to journey with you. So we have Sean and Dax and Carson who are on the call. Tajay is not here with us today, and Zoraida is not here with us today, but they're all amazing folks. If you would like to have somebody journey with you or just have a conversation about your own claiming of your spiritual authenticity and your fullness as a human being, we'd be glad to support you in any way that we can. And last thing I want to say before we go, in September in Arizona, after the heat wave is over, the last weekend in September, we are having an in-person retreat called Love Like You've Never Been Hurt. And those of you who have experienced love hurt from a religious and spiritual context or person, we encourage you to come, because we'll be touching on that as well. We know that religious trauma, religious hurt impacts every area of our lives. And our goal is to help people experience the wholeness and the freedom that every last one of us deserves. And I think that's it for today. Sean, anything else? We're done. Again, thank you. Blessings to everyone who listens in on this podcast, this conversation. And thanks to the panelists, and Sean, thanks for doing double duty, panelist and our communications person as well. And blessings. And as I started at the top of our time, namaste. The divine in me sees and honors the divine in you. Blessings.